Hello, everyone. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it is my pleasure to welcome you back to another episode of our, by now I can say, long-running series towards Life 3.0. Many of you will know that this is a title that we adopted from Max Tegmark's wonderful book called Life 3.0. Where the idea is to, in the book, the idea is to think about what life will be like after an intelligence explosion, what kind of ethical human rights regarding considerations will factor in, will matter once we have something like that. That is among the topic that Max Tegmark explores in that book. And it's a fantastic titles, but for our series, we're not just concerned with what will happen if there ever were to be such an intelligence explosion, but we are more broadly concerned with a whole range of ethics-related and human rights-related problems that arise in the digital space. As we are maybe on our way to an intelligence explosion, or that are problems that are very much upon us, even if it never comes to an intelligence explosion. That's the context here, and that series in turn is part of the Human Rights and Technology program that we have been running at the Carr Center. This has been one of our priorities for a number of years, also to explore what changes generally technological innovation brings to the human rights movement, to the understanding of human rights. And we are delighted today, Ethan Zuckerman with us, whom I introduce in a moment, who will talk about the good web. The title of the talk is The Good Web. I would like to pitch one thing as a cause of my own before turning to this, though. And I will make a connection in a second. I have actually my own research in this area has now finally delivered a book that is called Political Theory of the Digital Age. It's come out a couple of weeks ago. With a subtitle Where Artificial Intelligence Might Take Us. And I'm partly mentioned this now to kind of make a crude advertisement for it, but also partly because I've actually used exactly those bits of Ethan's work that I will mention in a moment when I introduce him. So there's an interesting cross connection there, also a way of saying thank you to Ethan for wonderful input that I've been able to work with myself, and many of you out there have been able to work with. Today, I will be joined by a co-moderator. That co-moderator is Albert Fox-Kahn, who is currently a Tech and Human Rights Fellow here at the Carr Center as part of the Human Rights and Technology program. And in his day job is to be the executive director of an organization called STOP, based in New York. STOP means Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, the name speaks for itself in terms of what they're up to. I encourage you very much to check out their website to get a sense of what they're doing around providing oversight for surveillance technology. And pop up once we come to the Q&A stage after Ethan's talk. Ethan Zuckerman is one of the preeminent voices aiming to make digital technology work out for everyone. He is currently an associate professor of public policy, communication, and information at UMass Amherst in the western part of our state here, which he joined in 2020. And before that, he had spent the better part of a decade at MIT, heading the Center for Civic Media there. At UMass Amherst, Ethan has founded the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, and that is also connected to the theme of today's talk, obviously. So it's the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure. I also encourage you to check out that website. And that is an institute that not only studies digital infrastructure, but distinctly advocates for treating digital infrastructure as public spaces and public goods, not as purely profit-making ventures. So to treat digital infrastructure more like parks than stores. And much as Ethan has written in his work quite a bit also about the communication technologies, how we have used other communication technologies in the past, in particular the radio and television, and much as public television and radio in the past, and obviously still in the current age, have complemented commercial broadcasting have not been supplanted by them, have complemented commercial broadcasting, and thereby have helped reach civic and educational goals. So one would hope that something like this can also be achieved in the digital infrastructure, because the commercial market is simply not geared towards doing that kind of thing, and is definitely not good at reaching civil and educational goals. And that's exactly where this space is, exactly where Ethan has been for a long time such an important voice. And two recent papers that I have made good use of in my own work, including that book that just came out, are the one paper called "The Case for Digital Public Infrastructure," and then another one called "What is Digital Public Infrastructure," in which Ethan basically lays out the foundational ideas that are also behind this Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure that he has since gone on to found at UMass Amherst. And I'm sure all these themes will also factor in the talk that he is now about to give on the good web, as among the coolest titles I've encountered in recent times, the good web. So we have high hopes for this talk, Ethan. I'm gonna turn over the screen to you. Let me say one last thing to the audience members. As always, you are very much encouraged to raise questions, to ask questions. Please put them in the YouTube chat, and we will be screening them and integrating them in the Q&A later after Ian's talk. And now, without further ado, Ian, over to you.
Well, Matthias, thank you very much.
Ethan, Ian, over to you.
It's okay. I'm going to make one very modest correction, which is that it would make more sense if we were an institute. We're actually an initiative for digital public infrastructure. It basically has to do with whether the provost has to sign off on these things or not. He has not, and therefore anyone can take the initiative. Not everyone can be an institute. This doesn't matter to anyone except for people who outrank me at UMass Amherst, which is the only reason that I'm saying it. But what I actually want to talk about is what has been a bit of a dark and maybe frustrating moment for social media. I would say since 2016, where we had the big surprises of a US election that didn't turn out the way most pundits thought it would, and a UK election where the UK left the European Union, there's been a lot of criticism about whether social media is starting to be harmful to democracy. Is the spread of dis and misinformation harming our ability to function as a democratic society? There's also a critique that the internet is preying on vulnerable individuals, that it is turning people towards extremism and perhaps towards violent extremism. And there are very reasonable cases made that the internet is sucking people into rabbit holes of extremist thought, and might have something to do with events like the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. And I want to try to counter some of this while simultaneously taking it very seriously. And I often find myself turning to my dear friend, Dr. Casey Fiesler, over at Colorado University Boulder, who very wisely says social media is really good for people. Social media is really bad for people. And those two things can be true at the same time. There are many, many people for who social media has been an absolutely necessary part of their socialization, their political education, their civic lives. There are other people for whom social media has led them down very dark and disturbing paths. And I think we need to approach this question of what we want social media to be and what we want it to do with this understanding that it can be really bad, it can be really good, and that we should be working to engineer social media in such ways that we get more of the good than the bad. And that doesn't sound like a radical concept, but often it is. Often what's happening in these conversations is that we are starting to take the notion of a digital public sphere seriously. We're starting to take seriously this idea that wrapped around the existing branches of government is this space in which we as citizens in a democracy learn about what's going on in the world, contemplate what it is, make up our minds, and potentially take action. But when we actually talk about changing or regulating that space, often what's going on is really weak tea. And I would go ahead and say, even in this week's Supreme Court decisions, we have seen fairly weak tea. Under US law, it's really difficult to go after what people say in these spaces. We have very strong rights of speech in this country. So asking to regulate mis or disinformation gets really uncomfortable. You're asking either a government to step in and prohibit speech, or you're asking a corporation to stand in for a government. We might be able to increase transparency, but to what end? Right now, we have very little competition in these spaces. Even if we find out that Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Twitter is causing harm, is sending us down internet rabbit holes, it's hard to know how we would pull away from those platforms given their immense social and fiscal power. And so we have these open questions about whether we can mitigate harms of existing social media. But right now, the policy solutions, to me at least, seem quite limited. What we don't do nearly enough, in my opinion, is try to imagine social media that might actually work radically differently. And so, what my lab, what my initiative tries to do is to imagine and then build social media that might not that might have aspirations just beyond being less worse. I'm actually interested in this question of whether social media can make us better citizens and better neighbors. Can it help us interact with a world that is broader rather than narrower? Can we take some of these critiques that I think are absolutely legitimate about what's going on in social media and move beyond them to building social media that's actually good for us as social beings? And I want to take us back in history to talk about the many different people from many different approaches who are trying to solve this problem. So I want to go back and tell you a little bit about a guy named Paul Baran. Baran was an utterly remarkable thinker. Came to the United States during World War II, ended up working for the RAND Corporation, as so many brilliant mathematicians and early computer scientists and theorists did. And Baran was asked to take on a very specific challenge. How do you build a communications network that survives a nuclear war? And Baran ended up saying, look, the way that we normally build communications networks are highly centralized. We put a transmitter in the center, we put all sorts of receivers out there. That's not going to work. We need to figure out how to communicate between where the missiles are in Colorado and Washington, D.C. And if someone blows up St. Louis in a centralized structure, it just doesn't work anymore. And what Baran ended up advocating for was a distributed structure. He ended up saying, you want to have a communications network where everyone talks to everybody else. And he was actually able to demonstrate that with a communications network where each node was talking to 8 other nodes. So rather this one central node broadcasting, everybody talks to 8 peers, you would have a network that was so resistant to interruption, it would almost be at the best performance line. And of course, what's wonderful about this is he actually demonstrates this via computer simulation in 1962. So people read this paper and they say, well, Paul, how are we going to do this? How does communication actually happen on this distributed network? He says, no problem. I've just invented something called packet switching. That turns out to be the fundamental innovation behind the internet. So Baran in 62 is proposing this architecture that turns into a packet switched internet in 1969. The rest is the history, both the positive and negative, that we are interacting with. And I bring this out not because I think the solution to the problems of social media is to connect to 8 other people via radio nodes, although, that might be an interesting social network. It's that somewhere there are philosophical underpinnings of ways in which people organize themselves on the internet based around these 3 models from Baran. Baran was very suspicious of these centralized networks. He was very, very optimistic about these distributed networks, which turn out to be very robust, but also very expensive to run. And he was quite uncertain about this middle class called the decentralized network. Baran felt like they had the same problems as the centralized network. They were just a whole bunch of little centralized networks joined to one another. I think Baran is wrong. And you'll find out in this that I think decentralized networks are the interesting way to go forward. But what I would say is, for the most part, internet people really like the theory of the distributed network. Everyone talks to everyone else, pure peers. In practice, the internet tends to be a highly centralized network. We tend to have centralized people in charge. So if we look at this sort of as a whole, existing platforms like a Facebook or a Twitter are largely centralized media. There are some great examples of how decentralization works. The domain name system is a classic decentralized system. The Fediverse, with tools like Mastodon that people are now proposing as alternatives to Twitter, that turns out to be a great example of a decentralized system. And now we have an enormous amount of enthusiasm, maybe less than about a year ago, for these distributed systems like blockchain, like Web3. Right now, systems like Twitter are the ones that we spend the most time on. At the end of the day, there is one person, not particularly a stable one, making decisions about what happened on the centralized network that is Twitter. And the problem is not actually just that one person runs the network. The problem isn't that that person is Elon. The problem is that a network like Twitter has a really difficult governance problem. It is something that we might call a big room network. Basically, what's happening on Twitter is we're asking people to pretend that they're all in the same room. And because we're all in the same room, we all have to follow the same rules and same norms. And we don't, right? We all want to use Twitter slightly different ways. Elon likes to use Twitter to post jokes. Other people like to use Twitter to have serious discussions. Other people use it as a very lightweight social network. And a lot of the conflicts that we have come when people bump into each other and essentially say, you're using the room wrong. It's really tough to solve moderation problems for a big room network because you're asking one room to meet everyone's different needs. There's another group of platforms called group hosting platforms, the best example of which is probably Reddit, that get us partway towards that solution. On Reddit, you could have a group of people saying, hey, over here, we're going to talk about cheese making. You want to talk about abortion? Don't do it here. We're going to take that down. But if you want to talk about cheese making, follow the following rules. Those are much easier to govern in some ways. They bump into the problem that they're still hosted by an Elon Musk. They're still hosted by a central figure. And you often will end up with conflicts between the small room and the larger platform. Before blowing up big room networks, it's probably good to note that they can be really important. One of the reasons Twitter has been such a great space for activists is that someone working on an issue like Black Lives Matter can go into a big room and say, look, I want to talk to everybody. I need you all to understand how important this issue is. Please come join in, be part of it with me. We now have a lot of people looking at the power of these centralized networks and saying, geez, Elon is an existence proof that we shouldn't do it this way. We should bring the power back to the people. We should decentralize. What we really want to build are these networks that are decentralized from the ground up. Let's look at an inspiration of something like Bitcoin. Anyone should be able to connect a machine to the Bitcoin network. They should be able to mine Bitcoins, which means they should be validating Bitcoin transactions. They can be their own independent node within this larger project. And this has turned into the thinking of perhaps we could do this for the social web. Perhaps we could build our own social web. And maybe in the process, we'll make a whole bunch of money, because one of the things that seems to happen in this is tokens that are both currencies within systems and votes within systems. Here's one example of an early Web3 experiment. This is DTube. This was an attempt to create YouTube via a distributed system. And what you can see under each of these videos is something that is a measure of currency. So under Let's Play Super Auto Pets is 21 DTC. That is 21 DTube coin. This is a system that decided that the problem with YouTube was that it wasn't monetized enough. If we could just get to the point where everyone was compensated for the videos they created, people would be compensated for voting for videos, for commenting on videos, and this would create a currency that did two things. One, it could be tradable with the outside world. People might invest in DTube coins, people might pay each other in DTube coins. But second, we could use this to create a distributed autonomous organization, a DAO. We could have a new governance system in which the money we make in DTube coins become votes in this decentralized system. This is one of these super clever ideas that turns out to be very difficult to execute in practice. DTube has never really grown beyond a few thousand users. It has turned into some amazing case studies. An early version of it, or early precursor to it called Steemit, basically got hijacked when someone figured out how to steal those coins that were votes and actually picked up the site and moved it to Korea and basically rebuilt it with Korean users rather than US users. DTube has been dealing with terrible extremism problems. And what's really interesting about it is that on the technical side of it, it's not actually distributed. It's one web server, but it's controlled by a whole lot of people who are trying to work together and vote. There are true distributed social networks out there. Perhaps the best of them is one called planetary.social. It's built on a protocol called Secure Scuttlebutt. We can get into the details if we want in the discussion. What I will say is that these networks have had a very tough time gaining traction. And I think the main reason they've had a tough time gaining traction is that a lot of the things we want to do with a social network, we want to tag people, we want to, mention them in our posts, they're actually very hard to do in truly distributed social networks. In truly distributed social networks, you are the only person who controls what's going on in the network. It's very hard to get anyone else to do anything. And so even to sort of have them agree to be mentioned on your stream, something that's trivially easy on a Facebook or on a Twitter, sometimes can become a real negotiation within these protocols. They are promising, they're very interesting, but they may well be quite overbuilt for the job. And what we're now starting to see sort of, several years into maybe it would be a good idea if we all got off of Twitter and got onto something better, we're seeing people start to play around with decentralized networks. The Fediverse is a decentralized network. If you join Mastodon, you are joining a Mastodon server. That server is run by someone who is their own little Elon Musk. They may have much better values, much better character than Elon Musk, but they do have power. They own the machine. They own the rules of that specific community. At best, what this means is when you join the Fediverse, you join a set of people who share your common values. And then all of these little Fediverse servers hold hands and exchange information between them. So when you join the Fediverse, you're joining one of those communities, and then you are potentially federating, you're joining with all the rest of those communities. The hope is that this gives us local rules and local control, but it also gives us some of the big room benefits that we want to get out of a platform like Twitter. Here's what's challenging about this. Either you tend to end up with the same rules on every platform, in which case it's really hard to have specific rules for a specific community, or you end up with very sharply different rules and it's hard for everyone to hold hands and join together. Mastodon is not actually that new. It got started in 2017. And one of the things that happened about half a year into the evolution of Mastodon was that it got a huge influx of users from Japan. It's a particular set of users from Japan. It was users who had been kicked off of Twitter because they were exchanging lolicon. They were exchanging drawn material of underage people in sexual situations. So they would draw a strong distinction between this and child pornography. This is drawn, so it's fantasy, it's not photography. But it is imagery that makes a whole lot of people, myself included, very uncomfortable. And it made Twitter uncomfortable. But they were able to start their own Mastodon server. And suddenly, people who were early pioneers on Mastodon found themselves federated with lots of people trading imagery that they really weren't super comfortable with. And they did what federated networks do, they defederated. So for a while, there was sort of a Japanese Mastodon that had a lot of this imagery on it. There was a non-Japanese Mastodon, which tended to be more of a conversational space, and you didn't necessarily have a lot of traffic between the two. That's probably Federation working as it should. We've had some moments where Federation may not be working the way it should. Shortly after a lot of people started leaving Twitter, you had a bunch of US journalists start a site called journo.host. You have a number of Mastodon nodes, including the one where I hang my hat, octodon.social, essentially saying some of those people are transphobic. We're not affiliating with them anymore. I'm now left in a really interesting situation. I don't really agree with my admin's decision. She's not going to change her mind. I can leave my community and go to a community where I can talk to my journo.host people. Or I could start my own Fediverse node and connect with those people. But this is all quite complicated. It works very, very differently than people are used to social networks working. We also don't know how networks like Mastodon are going to start dealing with really serious problems like child sexual abuse imagery. These tools don't have a lot of the same interfaces built into them in a way that a system like Facebook does. Facebook, to their credit, has actually invested enormous amounts of money in trying to combat things like child sexual abuse imagery. We're going to get to see whether the Fediverse can handle this. I want to suggest that this decentralized architecture actually might be important for a very different reason, which is the way in which I would argue human society ends up being structured. Here is perhaps a conceptual way of thinking about a bunch of communities that I'm part of. I'm part of a work community. I'm part of a community of high school friends. I'm part of a community of people that I trade funny cat memes with. I talk to other people in my neighborhood or people in my church. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I have people that I'm interacting with in that community. And the truth is, even though these are all aspects of my personality, I might want to have different interactions with these people in different parts of my life. In particular, maybe I don't want my Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and my work life crossing over all that much. Maybe that would be really problematic. I probably want some different rules for these different conversations. That local government conversation, I probably want that to be very carefully moderated. I want that to be not particularly freewheeling. Whereas when I'm talking with my high school friends, I'd be very upset if someone were coming in and policing our speech. So I'm interested in whether we can use these architectures to build social networks that work a little bit more the way human society does, which is to say it's decentralized. We are members of many, many different groups. And so one of the big things that my lab is working on is very small online platforms. The idea behind a very small online platform is that it is not trying to be everything to everyone. It is a platform for a specific purpose. It might involve 10 people. It might, in some cases, involve millions of people, but it's most often going to involve somewhere between maybe 100 and 1,000. Very small online platforms aren't for everything. They're not for every kind of conversation. They work best when you say, here's what this is for, here's what we're going to do on it. And I also think very small online platforms are going to be a great space for investigating what it's like to manage a community online. And I will mention, I think this is important because I'm very interested in the idea that managing online communities may be a way in which we learn to be good civic participants. In the same way that Robert Putnam used to dream of people participating in the local bowling league, I think participating in managing a small online platform may actually be the sort of civic education that we need people to start getting. So what might these look like? My favorite example is a network called an Archive of Our Own. This is a very small online platform that's actually very big. It hosts something like 5 million users, but it's a very specific group of users. It's fanfic writers. These are people who were very sad that there were only 7 books of Harry Potter and have been writing book 8, 9, and 10. These are people who are writing Star Trek episodes, who are extending any fictional universe, using the universe and the characters, but telling their own stories. And fanfic has a deep history in parallel to the internet. It's been going on since the 1970s. It's mostly a woman-based field. And it's a field that has been online since very, very early, but has often been chased off of other platforms. And eventually, a remarkable woman named Naomi Novik, a very famous sci-fi novelist, said, you know what? I've had it. We need our own space. And she helped organize a huge group of people to create their own platform. This platform has affordances. It has particular technological accommodations that make it easy to have these conversations about fanfic. It's really well suited to their needs, much, much better suited than other technology platforms might be. It's also self-governing. There is an NGO that supports this. That NGO has started an advocacy organization. It started an academic journal. It's a very large, complex project, but it's also an existence proof of why it might make sense for a community to break away from existing social media platforms and build their own. Here is a much less exciting social network. This is a social network that we've been spinning up in Amherst, Massachusetts. It's called Amherst Talks. It uses software that we call Small Town. Small Town is something that we call the world's most boring social network. The idea on Small Town is that you can talk about a limited set of small town issues. And these are the issues likely to come up at the upcoming town meetings. We talk with the local media providers, the people who are providing community television. We talk with city halls. What are the issues that are coming up at town meeting? How can we inform people about a debate like what would happen if we made Pleasant Street one way? And we ask people to participate in it. The interesting thing is if you limit and scaffold participation like this, you actually get remarkably high quality participation. And this is true over on Archive of Our Own as well. They have many fewer problems with moderation than you would think by virtue of the fact that they have fairly clear purposes and rules of the road. I actually think there's enormous value in building small civic networks. I think it might be able to help people connect to local civic life, which is really often hard for people to relate to. It's hard for people to take time to go to town meetings, and platforms like this open up the possibility of broader participation. There's a wonderful project coming out of the Netherlands called Pub Hubs. This is a way of trying to create small social networks around groups in society. The parents of all the 7th graders at the local high school, all the people who go ice skating together on the same canal. And rather than using Facebook groups or Google groups, Pub Hubs are independent servers that might be run by those local social institutions. In the Netherlands, there's a lot more confidence in institutions like the schools, like local governments, and this may be a very lightweight way of creating groups that are literally supported as part of public infrastructure. The big piece that I am working on with this right now is trying to figure out how we experience a pluriverse, how we experience these new social networks like Small Town, but also these existing social networks like Facebook and Instagram and Reddit, which I don't want to give up on. And I think the way to do this is actually to create clients that you as a user have control over. There is no reason we should use Facebook's tools to look at Facebook. And there's certainly no reason that we should follow Facebook's algorithm that says that this friend is more important than this other friend. I should have the ability as a user to say, I would like to mix my social media together. I would like to filter it in particular ways. And I would also like to be quite parsimonious about what information I give back to those platforms. We are developing a piece of software called Gobo. In its first version, Gobo is simply a client For Twitter, Mastodon, and for Mastodon descended social networks like Smalltown, it also supports Reddit. And it lets you both read and post to those platforms at the same time. That's going to be coming out this spring. In more advanced versions of this coming out in the summer and the fall, you're going to be able to do something called a lens. You're going to be able to pick a way that you want your view of the world to be tuned. A lens might say, today I just want factual information. Anything that is a low trust news source, filter it out, please. Or it might say, today is a day that I really need pictures of cute puppies. Please filter in some extra puppy pictures and amplify the puppy pictures that are already in my feed. You should be able to make that choice, and you should also be able to examine and audit the algorithms that are doing that for you, and that is well supported within the Gobo interface. This is part of a larger structure that we are advocating for. We call it the three-legged stool. It has three components to it. There is a pluriverse, a mix of small and large platforms. Some are corporate, some are civic, some are community-based. Some you have no ability to govern. You have almost no right in governing Facebook. Some might be ones that you govern yourselves. The second is a loyal client. This is a client loyal to you. It carries out your will in these digital spaces. It gives you what you want, and it allows you to control what you give back to the platforms. And then finally, there is the friendly neighborhood algorithm store. You need this to make Gobo work because you need to find these lenses so that you can look at social media, but the platforms need it too. If you're running Smalltown, if you're running Mastodon, you're going to need anti-harassment, anti-child sexual abuse materials, and you are likely to be able to pay for these things within a marketplace of people creating auditable applications. So this is the architecture that I'm trying to build. I'm trying to build some combination of platforms, clients, and resources, and those are the technical architectures. There's a whole set of social architectures that we have to work on at the same time. We have to study governance. We have to do more work on case studies of where this has succeeded in the past. We need communities that are actually going to do experiments around this, particularly communities of people who've been traditionally marginalized on social media. We need to be really transparent about this research. What are we collecting? What are we learning from it? We need to try this variety of different social architectures. But this very ambitious set of ideas takes us to this basic principle. I think social media could be good for us if we work to make it good for us. The answer is not just to fix what's wrong with social media now. We need to imagine, to fund, and to build a better internet, particularly a better social internet. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to share this with you. I hope we can have a good discussion about this coming out of that presentation.
Wow, this is very exciting stuff, Ethan. Before turning over to Albert for the first question, let me again encourage the audience to put your questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll be factoring the go along. Albert, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And Ethan, really a fantastic presentation. I say this as someone who is a self-avowed Web3 curmudgeon, is the way I typically put it. I guess the first question I have is, there's a lot of ways in which the internet can be better if users are willing to invest substantial time in making it a better place. But we've seen, social media take off because of the ease of using these really terrible and broken platforms. Mm-hmm. How do you think that you can avoid that sort of self-selection problem where it's only the people who are already showing up to the town meetings who sign up for the very small online platform about town meetings?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We actually get a different self-selected group. So the people who are showing up for town meetings tend to be older, they tend to be richer, they tend to be property owners in town. The people who self-select for small civic networks, for instance, tend to be techie, they tend to be geeky, they tend to be younger, they tend to be more technically savvy. So you are definitely getting a subset, and there is definitely, a subpopulation problem. But it's different subpopulations. And for one thing, that's actually sort of encouraging to me. I think some of this is to say, We are imagining a very wide number of platforms for a very wide number of uses. Right now, we're watching what people are doing in the Netherlands with pub hubs very closely. And what they're trying to do is say, here are groups that already exist and that you are probably already a member of. You are probably already in touch with the other parents, in your kid's school. You are already likely to be in touch with people sort of already in your neighborhood. So you might think of, targeting something like Facebook groups or targeting something like Nextdoor as these groups that you're getting into. And actually, those have pretty broad usage. It's not universal, but it is pretty broad. And it's a different group than the people who are leaving Twitter for Mastodon, who I agree with you are, the heavily techie, the people who are using desktop Linux, things along those lines. So my hope in some ways is that we suck people in through communities by sort of saying, hey, this is what your community is using. It happens to be open source. It happens to have very good values behind it. Oh, and by the way, the tool that you're using to access this, you could actually use to take control of the rest of the social media. So it's a bit of a Trojan horse strategy there, but it starts by sort of accepting this idea that there might be a whole lot of different social networks that people are using and starting to architect for a world in which we want lots of different networks rather than one network to rule them all. One network to rule them all is really great if you're Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, and it's really terrible for almost everybody else.
And I guess the follow-up there then becomes, is there a way to then have a client that can engage with, a platform like Facebook, given the existing IP landscape, given the restrictions that Facebook has placed in its own terms of service? Or is this something that will potentially take, regulatory or legal intervention to facilitate?
So it's a really astute question. It's absolutely the way to go. I showed a slide and I didn't go into the details because I was trying to be good about my time limit. But there are networks that are easy for us to incorporate into a client like this, and there are ones that are hard for us to incorporate into a client like this. Mastodon is easy. Reddit is easy. Reddit's really good. It's got a really nice open API. I use a third-party client to interface with Reddit all the time. Up until about 3 weeks ago, Twitter was really easy. Now Twitter is really hard. Whether Twitter will stay really hard, I don't know. For a long time, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, believe it or not, LinkedIn is much, much worse than Facebook or Instagram about sort of being willing to support third parties. They're, as far as I can tell, they're the worst out there so far. There is a long tradition in technology called adversarial interoperability. What it basically means is, you don't want to interoperate with me? Okay, I'm going to interoperate with you. And people have done this in the past by sort of saying, we're just going to re-engineer your standard. We're going to speak the language that you speak, and we should be able to ingest the information from it. Will Facebook sue us? Yeah, almost certainly. And so those questions become, where do you want to find relief? You could find relief legislatively. You could hope that the US Congress will pass legislation that demands deep interoperability. The EU walked right up to the line. They basically said, we're going to make messaging systems interoperable, probably not realizing that messaging might actually be harder. It's actually probably easier to make social media systems interoperable. And for the next round of digital legislation, that's clearly on the table in Europe. In the US, where we don't really pass legislation anymore, it's going to be a court battle. And it's going to be a question of a district court essentially saying you have a right to do this or you don't have a right to do this. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how you queue that up. How do you get people talking about that issue? So you're absolutely right that there are issues there. One of the things that I've discovered is that as a tenured professor, you make a real good defendant. It's hard for you to lose your job, and it's often very consistent with what you're doing in the rest of your work to find yourself in one of these court cases. So I will not go into more detail than that, except to say that it's absolutely the correct question for you to be asking.
Ethan, let me let me go back to something that actually I said at the very beginning, an image that I introduced, and I think it's an image that you also use in your earlier public infrastructure, namely the image of digital public infrastructure being like a park. So the park idea features there. And I'm having a bit trouble finding the decentralized structures in the park idea. So you said, and you illustrated this quite nicely, how, human society, much of human life is decentralized in this way. There is something comforting, and also it's a very natural thought that we have these different niches, and we have, good reason often for these, niches to be separate from each other. But then that's what we have, right? So we have these separate parts, and the idea of the park is like, the idea of the forum, the ancient, the democratic ancient open space where you might rub shoulders with whoever, is of the same status as you as a participant in the community. So, and I wonder if we wanted to approximate the park, is the decentralized structure, is that really the way, or aren't either of the other two models more suitable for that? So in particular, a suitably modified centralized structure. So yes, not Mark Zuckerberg, not Elon Musk, but a democratic takeover, a democratically decreed takeover, a parkification, so to speak, of Facebook. Is something like that not a better way of approximating the park idea?
So one of the tricks with these analogies, where we try to analogize virtual spaces to physical spaces, is that they're imperfect and incomplete. When we analogize to parks, and it's our friend Eli Pariser who does this the most often, it's this notion that there should be spaces that are largely commerce free, that should be open to all comers, and that should be accessible for multiple different uses. But here's the thing. It's possible for us to interact in a park, and I can have a quiet philosophical discussion in one corner of it, and you can play a football match in the other side of it, and we're not in each other's way. That's much harder to do in digital spaces. And this is really what I'm dealing with this concept of the big room. I think we actually trip ourselves up a lot by assuming that what we want is a publicly owned and publicly run Facebook or Twitter. I actually think probably a much healthier way to do this is something much more like a publicly owned Reddit, where you can come in and essentially say, here in this corner of the park, we're going to be doing this. And if you want to come hang out with us, our group has decided that this will be the following rules associated with this. If you want to do something radically different in the other corner of the park, that's great. You can come too. So I think having platforms like that, platforms that are capable of hosting a whole bunch of different conversations with a whole bunch of different rule sets and making them publicly accessible, that to me is much closer to how I conceive of the park. I'll come back to something else that Eli likes to say. Eli says, when we architect public spaces in real life, we don't build a whole lot of spaces where random strangers yell at us and we stand around and listen to them. There's Speaker's Corner in London. There aren't a ton of other ones. And even that tends to be, not an everyday sort of experience. I think what we actually want is to replicate this idea of accessibility, this idea of multiple users of a shared resource, but not necessarily the single shared space. The other thing that I would say is that not all conversations take place in parks. Some take place in coffee shops or in bars. And part of this architecture that I'm suggesting is one that can combine public and private. It would be a very reasonable thing in the model that I'm proposing for your neighborhood coffee shop to have a social network that only involves the coffee shop. You can basically go in and say, hey, I'm here. Here's who I am. If you want to talk with me, I'm here having my coffee. Come say hi. And it might only work while you're in the coffee shop. It sounds crazy that a coffee shop would run a social network, But a social network like that might cost $100 or $200 a year. They're not enormously expensive if you're not trying to serve billions of people and surveil them simultaneously. So that's part of how we've ended up with this architecture that is really about lots and lots of small different rooms, basically collectively representing that park that you're very right to invoke.
So one thing that I keep flashing back to is this idea of the three different modes of network creation. And when I think about the distributed and decentralized approaches, the other thing I flash back to is the Moxie Marlinspike critique of cryptocurrency. That in that we've seen a decentralized platform becoming adopted widely because it then gets intermediated by a centralized platform, which is vulnerable to all of those same concerns. When you think about sort of building out the Fediverse, having mass adoption, how do you prevent a repetition of that history where the mechanism that most users turn to make it accessible doesn't effectively replicate all of the sins of centralization?
Pure distribution in a network is really, really hard. So Baran proposed it because it's really resilient. Internet people who think in internet ways tend to gravitate to that as their main paradigm. But even the most basic internet systems tend not to actually work that way. The DNS system is amazingly distributed. There are millions and millions of DNS servers out there. And at the end of the day, there are 17 root servers that tell them where to look, for the ultimate address tables. That's a centralized system at the heart of it. And so that is a decentralized rather than a distributed system. Bitcoin, for all of its sins, is a remarkably distributed system. But it is a distributed system that has a lot of centralization in it. There are people who run enormous mining pools within it. It's actually quite an achievement that they figured out how to do things with that level of distribution and decentralization. It is also an energy nightmare because they are basically paying insane energy costs so that they don't have the single points of failure. As soon as something like Ethereum comes in and says, we're going to be much saner, what they end up doing is they trade that distributed network for a decentralized network. They end up with significantly more centralization. That's part of what happens in proof of stake. This is just sort of physics within these systems. If you want true distribution, if you want the censorship resistance, if you want the everyone can go their own way, you end up with networks that are really, really inefficient and really expensive to run. And by the way, really, really, really challenging to govern. If you have a network like Secure Scuttlebutt that Planetary.social is using, and you start using it to post CSAM, there's really nothing we can do other than stop following you. We can't delete it because most of what it's using are these distributed file systems that simply go and replicate things. And it's very, very hard to delete in a paradigm like that. So there's all sorts of stuff that sounds wonderful when you're up on this Baran level of true distributed networks that once you actually try to start engineering it, ends up being a nightmare. I have a whole riff about what does a comment on a blog post mean in a distributed network? Is it on your post? Well, that's yours. I can't write on yours. I have to write my thing. So how do I intertangle my stream with your stream? It's just hard. It's hard for the head. We tend to gravitate instead towards centralization. And the Fediverse gives us part centralization and part decentralization. And in that sense, I think if we do it intelligently, it's a terrific way to go. Where I think we're going is we're trying to replicate the big room effects of Twitter. We have Mastodon.social cresting over 1 million users. That's not a community at that point. That's now, Eugen Rothko sort of dictating this is how that specific area of cyberspace is going to work. And that's not a great place to be. I'm much more interested in people who are doing things like social.coop, where people are literally paying into a co-op structure to run the node and agreeing to be part of the governance piece of it. So I do think there are ways we can do it, but I think it forces us to be so much more realistic about what's easy and hard about these architectures and these protocols.
Let me give you two audience questions now, and then we're probably coming to the end of our time. So question one is as follows. Are these small groups built around a community of shared interests / shared expertise just a return to the early days of chat rooms and message boards with much better tech? Question one. Question two. Could ActivityPub and Mastodon protocols be extended to support whatever it is that Gobo needs? Why build something new instead of extending what we already have?
So let me take the second one first. So Smalltown is built on ActivityPub. We are not creating a new standard. At the same time, Gobo understands that not everyone is going to use ActivityPub. So ActivityPub may be our native language, but we're going to speak Twitter, we're going to speak Reddit. But as far as developing our own social networks, everything we develop in my shop is open, it's on existing standards. So Smalltown is a Mastodon fork with a bunch of other features and Federation shut off. In the course of building Smalltown, we added OAuth to it. We ended up merging that into the core code. So Mastodon now supports OAuth because we wrote that, because we needed it for our thing, and we're merging it into the code base when we need to. So not building our own thing. The reason you can't build it into ActivityPub without building your own client is twofold. Right now, ActivityPub isn't spoken by everybody. Till Facebook, till Reddit, till Twitter speak ActivityPub. If you want a client to support them, you got to do it that way. The second is that we are big believers that the end-to-end principle still applies. You at the edge of the network should have the most control over things. So we're being inspired by things like email clients and Usenet clients that basically say, give me the bits, and then it's my responsibility at the client to sort them the way that I want to. ActivityPub handles this at the server level. They have a server that goes and federates with other servers, fetches stuff in. It's fine if you can run your own server. Most people are not in a position to do that. They run clients, even clients on things like mobile phones. That's what we're engineering for. The first question, aren't we just trying to go back to the old web of chat rooms and such? Oh yeah, absolutely. But we're trying to do it within a pluriverse model, which is to say, there's a lot of things that I don't want to lose about this last 15 years of social media. This ability for someone to try to reach a global audience with an important message, I think that's really cool. The closed loop between participatory media and the press, I think it's problematic and complicated, but I also think it's really powerful, and I would not want to shut it off. But I do think there are a lot of things that we lost from smaller groups on the internet, and particularly from people able to build and control their own groups. I want to make that easier. I want to make it part of a multifaceted and complicated social internet. And that, more than anything, is what I worry about. It's the complicated. This vision that I'm putting forward is complicated. You know, we wrote a very simple, here's just the facts of it white paper, and it's 15 single space pages. It's really hard to try to get, you know, all these concepts down. Unfortunately, I think to do this well and to have this pluriverse vision as well as a user empowered vision, that's about as good as we're going to do. And where we need a lot of help on this is figuring out how to implement this in ways that users who just want to talk with their friends or who just want to talk with their neighbors are able to use this without having to think about that whole larger structure surrounding it.
I guess on the last note, we're talking about so many heavy topics, looking at all the ways these entrenched systems have failed us. But do you think we should be optimistic that the internet we have in 10 years, 20 years will be better than the one we have today?
I do a podcast called Reimagining the Internet. And my rule for reimagining the internet is I will only have you on as a guest if you can tell me real productive ways that you think the internet could be better. And I have some very critical people on that internet. I've had, folks like Ruha Benjamin come on with, very fierce critiques of racism built into systems. I just had Janet Vertese, who's an amazing privacy advocate. But they've all been able to find ways, and often case studies and strategies, to make things better. And we're 70 episodes into this right now, so we're not running out of people who are moving in good directions. If you let go of this idea that a good idea needs to make someone $1 billion, the universe of good ideas expands exponentially. One of the real problems of the last 20 to 30 years is that the only good ideas that we've been talking about are ones that make someone $1 billion. And by the way, it's probably not you or me who's going to get the $1 billion. So if we can get rid of that and we can start thinking about what is worth doing because it makes us better friends and better neighbors and better citizens, there is no shortage of good ideas out there. We just have to find a way to bring those to the fore.
Well, that is one beautiful way to end. There's no summary, no outlook I could give that could beat that. So I will not even try to bring anything out there along such lines. So let me just thank you, Ethan, for being here with us today and for the amazing work that you do. And let's hope that, maybe 10 years from now, we're going to have a reunion, on the screen, and we'll check in on this and we see what's come of that. And hopefully we will have come to a better place compared to
we'll probably all be in the metaverse, and maybe by then we'll have legs.
We can only hope.
Thank you to the audience. Take care, everybody.